Welcome. Today we're going to begin our discussion of ethics with the philosophical system known as existentialism. At its very heart, existentialism looks at the choices that we make. Today we're going to pay attention to theistic existentialism through the works of Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky. Later on, we'll talk about other existentialists from the atheistic perspective with Sartre and with Nietzsche. At the end of today's lecture, we are going to look at the different criteria that are often used to judge moral theories. In beginning our discussion of existentialism, it's probably best that we kind of think about what it is as a very big, broad idea. What is your first impressions when we talk about existentialism and existentialist philosophy? Some of you might be talking and thinking about the word exist because it's in there, and I exist, and how does that relate to philosophy? And people maybe like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Usually, the notion that people have is that it's overly complicated, that it's not easily laid out from one thing to another, that if there's an easy way of talking about it, existentialist philosophy might go a little bit too far. Usually, kind of wrapped up in this as well, are the notions that it is overly cold and rationalistic. People think of, people pondering alone in the dark in some sort of cold environment. And yet, at the same time, we also see within a lot of existentialism that there's a lot of life and energy wrapped up in it. And we're not sure how we're going to wrap our head around the fact that it's both lively and cold. Usually, we're left with not as many answers when we approach this idea, and the idea that it becomes a little overly complicated. At the very heart and center of existentialism is the idea that life is all about the choices that you make. What you're going to do, should you choose this path or that path, and why? What are the consequences of that? There are a lot of choices we make that are really easy. Do I do this or not? And if you don't do that, you're, obviously a bad person. And if you do this, this is what's obviously going to make you good and right. But most of the decisions we have when we're talking about ethics aren't so easy to just define. It's not that one answer is clearly the stupid, dumb, bad answer and the other one's clearly the good one. What is the basis for morality and where is the good to be found in that? One of the people who first talked about this was Plato. Plato really tried to salvage the idea that your ethics matters. And while he's not an existentialist philosopher, we see the beginning of moral philosophy through the works of Plato and his reflection of Socrates, in trying to say that no, what we do and what we say do matter. Building on this, we have people like Aristotle, and later we'll talk about his notions of virtue ethics and his main philosophy that what we're striving after is this good life where we can flourish. The word that's usually used there for Aristotle is eudaimonia, a Greek term that we will talk about in another lesson. One of the greatest challengers to Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia is Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky lived from 1821 to 1881 in Russia. Now, Dostoevsky ends up looking quite a bit different for a lot of different reasons. His father was a doctor, like Aristotle's, so we have a similarity there. But while Aristotle, this was served in the court, for Dostoevsky, he lived on hospital grounds and saw sickness and disease that existed throughout all of 19th century Russian life. So it was definitely a different sort of perspective there. His family and himself were devout Orthodox Christians. Later on, he was sent to school in Moscow and to St. Petersburg. While his family was firmly middle class, this ended up putting him kind of on the outs of these schools because most of his classmates were aristocrats, and therefore he was the poor kid, even though he was better off than many others around him. While he was at school, because he was kind of on the outs with a lot of things, he ended up falling into a radical group of writers that were then arrested and sentenced to be killed. Right before he was to be shot, he was given a reprieve and instead sent to a work camp in Siberia. Now, this work camp is only slightly better than being executed, but you weren't being executed. And so it's very interesting to see this is one of those pivotal moments in Dostoevsky's life. And how would you respond with this moment as well? How do you think that a moment where you're certain you're going to die and there's nothing you can do about it, all of a sudden changes? You are inexplicably saved. Even if what you're being saved for sucks, a work camp, that's which is for some people almost even worse, you're not being executed. And this sort of experience kind of shapes most of his philosophy and his ideas moving through there. Upon his return, he would write a number of works. The Brothers Karamazov are probably, and Crime and Punishment are probably his more famous. But we have things like The Idiot and the Notes for the Underground and The Possessed as well. Dostoevsky's basic moral or philosophical teachings comes about through two different themes that you can find throughout all of his works. That is, first of all, that life is suffering. Right? Throughout his entire life, he sought and experienced this suffering. He saw the sick who were suffering. He felt persecuted and marginalized, and he suffered that way. He suffered in prison. He suffered in a work camp. He understands suffering. He lived a better life than many others, but it was still a life of suffering. And what Dostoevsky really wants to point out is that beauty can be found in suffering. That there can be some sort of beauty even in the moments of destruction and decay that is all around you. And so this is a very different notion than eudaimonia, right? Eudaimonia is about you flourishing and things going well. And here Dostoevsky wants to point out that even when things don't do well, there might be beauty still there. And so, again, you can think about how this is a challenge to Aristotle's ideas there. In Notes from the Underground, which is one of those works that he wrote after having this experience in prison, he says that we want happiness, which we'd all probably agree with, but we make ourselves miserable, that we love suffering. Now, I know this is kind of, you knee-jerk want to reject this idea, and many of you do, and then at the same time, many of you might go, you know what, there's some truth to that, right? How many of you are in relationships that are not good, but you're comfortable, that you like it, that the problems and the chaos are there? How many of you have some drama because everything else was too placid and nice? Right? Is it true that you make yourself miserable? That you don't truly want to be happy? That what we're really seeking is not just flourishing, but sometimes a little bit of misery? That you could possibly, in fact, love suffering? In the work, his character is addressing those who advocate for notions of modern progress, who believe that we need to reform humanity into something new and different. Here he's actually very explicitly criticizing the socialist and the communist ideal of the new, quote, perfect man. Against this philosophy of progress and improvement, he says that progress does not eliminate suffering. It only focuses on suffering and changes the focuses of different types of suffering. Here it's a very clear rejection of Marx and this idea. Dostoevsky argues that we may not be built to be perfect after all, and therefore this new perfect man that Marx and Marxists were arguing for is not something that's achievable. But the reason why he wants something, Dostoevsky argues, to go off on a tangent may be that he is predestined to make the road, and perhaps too, that however stupid the direct practical man may be, the thought sometimes will occur to him that the road almost always does lead somewhere, and that the destination it leads to is less important than the process of making it, and that the chief thing is to save the well-constructed child from despising engineering, and so giving away to the fatal idleness, which, as we all know, is the mother of all the vices. Man likes to make roads and to create. That is a fact beyond dispute. But why has he such a passionate love for destruction and chaos also? Notice here the idea is that sometimes the goal is not the end, but the journey, as we're going to see with some people like Ralph Waldo Emerson as well, another transcendentalist philosopher, fairly similar contemporary to Dostoevsky. But we also love chaos and destruction. It may not be, Dostoevsky continues, that he loves chaos and destruction. There can be no disputing that he does sometimes love it, because he is instinctively afraid of attaining his object and completing the edifice he is constructing. Does not man, Dostoevsky continues, perhaps love something besides well-being? Perhaps he is just as fond of suffering. Maybe you love to suffer as much as you love flourishing, and that you have these two different impulses within yourself. Perhaps suffering is just as great a benefit to you as well-being. Man is sometimes extraordinarily, passionately in love with suffering, and that is a fact, Dostoevsky argues. There is no need to appeal to a universal history to prove that. Only to ask yourself, are you a man? And have you lived it all? Like, this is almost sort of just out in your face, blatantly true for Dostoevsky, that we sometimes, not always, sometimes, love suffering. Do you think this is true? Do you occasionally love suffering? Dostoevsky argues, as far as my personal opinion is concerned, to care only for well-being seems to me positively ill-bred. Whether it is good or bad, it is something very pleasant to smash things. Right? Regardless of who you are, destroying things has some sort of value, even though it's not constructive, even though it's sort of, the opposite. Right? Is it pleasant to smash things, and why would that be? But what things also matter? Our decisions still matter greatly, even if it is in breaking things, that there's still value in your choosing to do what you do. And so, again, this is an interesting sort of critique of notions of eudaimonia and Aristotle, because he's adding in this whole sort of dark shadow as a perspective within all of that. In other works of Dostoevsky, we also learn a little bit further on his philosophy. In Crime and Punishment, we learn that we also do not know ourselves as well as we think that we do. We also know that even the worst among us within Crime and Punishment are not outside of God's love, and even they have some redeeming qualities, right? Even the worst person has something good about them, right? So it's not just everything's dour, but again, even in ugliness, even in suffering, there's some beauty, right? We have this sort of second sort of shot, right? There's always a silver lining to every cloud and a shadow to every beautiful thing, right? And we need to kind of learn from Crime and Punishment. How well do you know yourself? How well do you know who you are? Have you ever been in a situation where you thought you would act in one way, but you did the opposite? And did this surprise you? Right? I mean, many of us have gone through this countless times. If you haven't, congratulations. We'll see. In the work The Idiot, Dostoevsky tells about the clarity of near death, right? Very much coming from his own experience. He says that this has just huge value when you think you're going to die, that you become grateful for life, and that this gratitude and delight in life is so valuable. But everyone around you is going to look upon you just being happy for life and think you a fool, think you an idiot. And so this is where the character of this comes from. And maybe his other more famous work, The Brothers Karamazov, he says that we need to accept our own failings as part of our human condition as well, right? That we are not perfect, and we cannot think that we are to be perfect. That there is some failings within just the human condition, and yet this also means we still need to be redeemed and that redemption is necessary for the human condition. Beauty is really an important idea for Dostoevsky. As we're going to encounter later with Sartre, there's a statement from Dostoevsky that he once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted, or everything would be permissible, from another translation. For Dostoevsky, if God did not exist, then we enter into overwhelming despair, and ourselves, we would just simply be nothing. Right? So there needs to be, for Dostoevsky's philosophy, this other sort of guiding principle, this other God who is there. While the affairs in our life will distract us, this living life, a phrase that he uses, also adds up to nothing if there is no God. Further, if God is then our lives actually add up to something much greater than the sum total of all of our own experiences. Additionally, Dostoevsky is famous for his saying that beauty will save the world. And that this is, again, this idea that we need to have beauty. There's beauty even in despair, and this beauty is what saves us. Yet the world is also very clearly, for Dostoevsky, contaminated with sin, with fault, with failing. So beauty has to be something that comes outside of the world. It must have a moral, ethical, and spiritual dimension. And so for Dostoevsky, beauty is something that's linked to truth and to goodness. Specifically for Dostoevsky, this came down to his religious convictions as well. That beauty is found in this radiant image of Christ as celebrated through the Transfiguration, of which you see an icon that Dostoevsky would have been very familiar with right there. Dostoevsky also helped to articulate a personal creed to help him maintain his sort of bearing within all of this. He writes, I have constructed for myself a symbol of faith in which everything is clear and holy for me. The symbol is very clear. Here it is. To believe that there is nothing more beautiful, more profound, more sympathetic, more reasonable, more courageous, and more perfect than Christ. And not only is there nothing, but I tell myself with jealous love that there never could be. Right? There's this value in having this personal creed. For Dostoevsky, it very much has this religious dimension, but it helps him understand beauty and where this is and how it can relate with him. And having a guiding sort of principle within all of this is this idea of beauty and who it's found and personified with. Might want to think and maybe even share with others, do you have a personal creed? And what is it? And what sort of value might you have in constructing a personal creed? And would that help you to live a fulfilling life, even if you don't agree with all of the suffering part of Dostoevsky? If it's for that notion of eudaimonia, would a personal creed help you live a happy life as a complete life? Right? And modifying and clarifying your outlooks in life. Another creed that we'll encounter with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another Russian, but of the next century, and we'll come across him at the end of the semester as well. He says that you can resolve to live your life with integrity, but let your credo be this: let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph, but not through me. Right? This becomes his sort of argument, that even if the world is going to be deceived, I'm going to have my integrity. That even if the lies are going to win, and for a lot of Solzhenitsyn's life, that's exactly what he was expecting, but it's not going to come about through him. even if he's going to suffer from that, to which he did in the gulags as well. So we have these sorts of notions of a creed giving value and helping to clarify where you are and how you're supposed to understand your own life. Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard are both representatives of what's known as theistic existentialism. Obviously, theistic here implies the notion that there is a God who's going to help you out in determining who you are and how your existence is going to line up with your essence. This essence is something that is already known by this God. Again, it's about your choices and your place as the individual in relationship, that you are the responsible agent, and your choices help either reflect your existence and its place within your existence. Kierkegaard is a great model of theistic existentialism, as opposed to atheistic existentialism. In some ways, people look at this as an early versus modern, different interpretations of existentialism, of the whole God question or not. Kierkegaard on one side, and we also have Dostoevsky, who's also usually tied in with notions of theistic existentialism. But again, we're going to kind of look at this a little bit different. At the very heart of theistic existentialism is not actually just the God question, but the focus on your existence as the individual and you as the agent whose choices determines your essence. And for the theistic existentialist, you must align your existence with your essence, which is pre-known and pre-formed by God. And therefore, your actions must line up to what is known in a greater response of who you are. Practically, looking at the life of the man Soren Kierkegaard, there are many different things that we could say about him. He was born in 1813 and would die in 1855, a fairly relatively short life. Lived in Denmark, therefore obscure by the realms of most of our other philosophers that take place in France and Germany and England, the intellectual powerhouses of modern Europe, or ancient Greece, or elsewhere where there's centers of power and texts circulating all around you. He is a father of a movement, although never thought of himself as such. He would also pen thousands of words to convince readers that you cannot convince intellectually about Christianity, and he believed that it was his job to make Christianity harder, that this is something that you needed to internalize and make in your life. As such, he's often referred to as the melancholy Dane. Of the four major events that shape Soren Kierkegaard's life, the first is often referred to as the earthquake, and in fact might even take place before Soren Kierkegaard was born. You see here an image on the left of his father, and it said that his father grew up very, very poor, and at what point his father, Michael, will curse God for his poverty. This becomes part of the earthquake, not just because he was poor, but after cursing God for his poverty, he became tremendously rich. So this ends up having this sort of big, sort of odd moment. So Soren Kierkegaard's father became wealthy, as also Denmark was becoming more poor. In fact, great fires ravaged through all of Denmark, and his father's family emerged from that. Later, his brother Peter will go off, and who you see to the right, become a parson and kind of move past this event. But for Soren, who was born the very same year that the Danish state became bankrupt, this cursing of God was seen as a household curse that they all had to live under and live with their wealth. In fact, the earthquake even extended so much that Soren was told growing up that his inheritance would last just as long as he would, and that Michael also thought all of his children would die before he did. He saw many of his children die, except for Peter and Soren, who will outlive him. But this sort of idea of this dread always hanging over your head because you cursed God and yet got somewhat rewarded for it really kind of changed the way that he was going to approach his own life and everyone moving along those lines. The next major event is known as the Corsair Affair. Here, the Corsair is kind of like a National Lampoon, Weekly World News, Star, Gossip Times sort of magazine that existed during Denmark at the time. And it was, be important to show that you're important if you're getting lampooned a little bit in it. And this is kind of what's going to happen. Soren Kierkegaard had already entered into Danish society at this point. He was already a social critic, having criticized Hans Christian Andersen, who he was somewhat friends with. Andersen was able to kind of rebuff this criticism very easily. But Kierkegaard kind of was in there in that mix, but uneasy with some of this. He ended up kind of getting a review of one of his works that he thought came out way too soon. He believed that the author didn't even have time to read it, and therefore it was more just a caricature and not a real analysis of his literary work and of his thoughts. So Kierkegaard did what Kierkegaard does, which was use his quick wit, something that he was known for as a child. In fact, he even earned the nickname in school as the Fork, in part because he would be able to pin down his opponents, although his household kind of called him this because he would grab up the food before other people did. But this becomes kind of a nickname that he's got. And so he unmasks one of the pseudonyms of the author who wrote a review of his work. Kierkegaard thought you didn't have time to do it, and therefore I'm going to, publicly shame you. The Corsair ended up kind of becoming a little bit overreactionary, and it ends up kind of attacking, in very vicious cycle, Soren Kierkegaard. And this ends up becoming just widely known as the greatest literary debacle in 19th century Denmark. And it becomes one of those pivotal events in Kierkegaard's life, as well as the publication itself. The publication tries to backwater and eventually just folds. It's not able to kind of survive this affair. Kierkegaard kind of falls into a state of depression, but emerges. But his name becomes a source of derision. Soren, which was one of the more popular names in Denmark, if you actually follow the birth records, almost vanishes off of the list of names because nobody wants to name their child Soren in light of the debacle of what happened on the Corsair. So it's an interesting sort of idea that the name goes from one of the more popular ones to just, obscurity within his own lifetime. And this is the sort of trauma that it has. We also get these interesting depictions, these caricatures, these cartoons of Kierkegaard during the Corsair affair. If ever you see these images of Kierkegaard where he's kind of tall and gangly, or his face kind of looks off, where his teeth almost look like they're too big for his mouth and his nose is too pointy, and oftentimes he'll have kind of a hooched or crooked back. These are the drawings that came out of the whole Corsair affair as well. You have this sort of interesting idea where sometimes you've got Kierkegaard where he's kind of dashing looking, and other times you've got one there you kind of go, right? Those ones kind of grew out of this affair as well, and also become part of the lasting legacy of this. And again, the magazine will fold, the editor and publisher will kind of have to just kind of leave town for a while. And Soren Kierkegaard will eventually get his footing back and realize that he had gone too far with his critique. And this, of course, can happen to everybody. The next major event in Kierkegaard's life was actually an event that happened in Denmark. It didn't happen directly to him, and this was the Revolution of 1848. This, by the way, is the only real revolution that stuck in all of Europe. The king would lose his powers and establish a new constitution, which will in somewhat ways disestablish the Lutheran Church and also establish the Lutheran Church in a different sort of way in Denmark. It establishes what becomes known as the People's Church, where to become a Danish Christian was the same to be a Danish citizen. Kierkegaard thought this was an alarming thing, as the way he saw his job was to make Christianity more difficult And now the revolution not only has eliminated the monarchy, view of government that Kierkegaard thought was the best, according to other ones of his writings, where he simply says, of all forms of government, monarchy is the best, and now it is weakened. But it also then makes Christianity effortless, easy, and unimportant in Kierkegaard's understanding. He would refer to the members of Denmark then as geese. And while most of us kind of don't really think much about this insult, geese do two things. They are loud anywhere they show up, and they also leave a lot of crap wherever they leave. They're noisy and destructive. And this is really what he sees happening in Denmark as a result of the revolution of 1848 and the mobs that emerge with this. He believed that the Christianity of the New Testament could never be synonymous with an organization that would make compromises with other institutions, and now the church in Denmark was doing that. He strongly disagreed with a notion that was growing in popularity of vox populi, vox Dei, right? The voice of the populace, or the voice of the people, is the voice of God. And he thought that this was just an atrocity. And he believed that the revolution was a horrible thing, and this would bring on his attack upon Christendom, which is not Christianity, but the establishment of this sort of national identity as a Christian. The fourth event that would mark Kierkegaard in his life was his engagement to Regine Olsen, who lived 1822 to 1904. She outlived Kierkegaard significantly. He fell madly in love with her, really kind of at second sight. His first sight, he kind of liked her, and the second one, he's like, okay, I want to marry you. And eventually, he will move over and propose and be engaged to her. But Kierkegaard discovered very quickly that an engagement is easy to make, but not easy to keep. Once he proposed and envisioned having a happy life with the woman that he madly loved, he realized that he couldn't be married to her. While they shared religious perspectives, both of which grew up in Moravian or Pietist households, she was of equal or possibly even greater social standing than him. He found her physically attractive. There was no problem with any of that. And he'll talk about her beauty. And he also did find her a good muse for his work. Many of his works are dedicated to her, even after the broken off engagement. But he realized that he was put on this earth for work, that this becomes his job, this is his task, and this is what he must do. He realized that either he could be a good husband and neglect his work, or he can neglect his wife and continue to do his work, and therefore be a bad husband. He didn't see any sort of middle ground between the two. And so Kierkegaard will engage the rest of his life in work and break off his engagement to Regine Olsen. Of course, he knows that this would cause great scandal because, generally speaking, if you're breaking off an engagement in 19th century Europe, and Denmark as well, it was believed that the woman had done something wrong. And Kierkegaard loved Regine, or Regina, depending on translations, on so much that he didn't want to scandalize her. And so he acted crazy in public for months, or at least long enough to get everyone to think, okay, he's insane and she should break off the engagement, and that would be okay and not cause scandal. And it left her with her honor intact and would allow her to marry another. And so this is exactly what he did. Kierkegaard acted crazy, she broke off the work and was able to marry, and he could dedicate his life now to his work. Kierkegaard will spend the rest of his life writing profusely. Actually, there's a few different breaks in his authorship that he will have just moments where he stops and writes his no more, and then pick up and write again. And usually there's some sort of massive change that happens to correspond with some of these the loss or death of a friend, or the events of the world around him, or one of those four major events that we talked about, dividing it in there. You can kind of see some of his major works here, Either Or probably being his biggest and most known for. He'll have a series of what becomes known as edifying or upbuilding discourses, which are in some ways his way of trying to be a parson, a priest, a pastor, because he really was called to try to do this as well. And he would try to kind of encourage others in the life that are maybe just kind of more pastoral in his ways. He'll, see several different lists of those. He'll have other sorts of writings that are just different from one another. They become experiments in thought or in action. And oftentimes these will be kind of paired together in different works as well. What's really neat about Kierkegaard and his authorship is not just that he's got different periods where he kind of has different tones or expectations, but that he'll actually have a lot of these different tones coinciding with other events where he's writing things that are almost entirely different or from a different approach. And I don't mean that he's going to talk, when it's romance novels or sports or anything else along those lines, but he does have those upbuilding discourses. He'll also have other works that are written not by him, though they're by him, but by pseudonyms. Most of the time, people will have pseudonyms and they will use this to hide their identity. This becomes very much a literary fashion where people will try to hide who they are and then kind of just leave it there. And then maybe, maybe comment about it in the day or something else. But it's for a handful of reasons people want to hide their identity. Sometimes this was because they were a woman or Jewish in different groups, and you wouldn't want to do that because it wouldn't allow you to be published with different sort of social conventions. Kierkegaard didn't care. In fact, he would even write that he was the editor of these works, and he wasn't trying to hide his identity at all. But he would have different characters who would have different sorts of impulses, desires, points of views, perspectives. Some of whom he thought were fervent Christians, some of whom were not. Some of which were trying to be this sort of character and some who were that. Really, the idea for Kierkegaard is that he wanted to have a different sort of authorship, a different sort of writing where he'll say, I didn't write that. I mean, we all know I wrote that, but I didn't write that. That's not my opinion. That's the opinion of that character who I had write that book. In some way, we almost see like multiple personality disorder where they're all fighting to get out their voices, but it wasn't even that because he would organize it and know it all over the place. Either Or was written, or at least edited, by Victor Eremita. Repetition is written by Constant Constius, which is fantastic because, right, it's repeating itself and yet it's constantly repeating is kind of the name that he gets. Fear and Trembling is written by John the Silent, Johannes de Silencio. And here the idea of being the silent observer is throughout that work. Philosophical Fragments, which we'll get to later, is written by Johannes Climacus, the name of a Christian monk, John of the Ladder. Later on, at the end of his writing, he'll have things, his authorship, things like Sickness Unto Death and Practice of Christianity, are written by Anti-Climacus. Anti, not meaning opposed, but after or later. And so we can kind of see this sort of transition there. Concept of anxiety is Vigilantes Hoffness, right? The vigilant observer. Prefaces, Nicholas Notaby. We have Stages on Life Flyby, a hilarious bookbinder, right? So we have others, Inter et Inter, or HH, which just means the Copenhagen, as this was the symbol and identity of the town. So we have these different sorts of authorship with different sort of meanings to try to present different perspectives. He would also have different ones that are, edited by somebody else, by S. Kierkegaard. And in many ways, even S. Kierkegaard is a pseudonym. Where is Kierkegaard in all of his works becomes a little bit more difficult. And you kind of have to become a big Kierkegaard scholar to fully understand when can we say Kierkegaard is saying this and when didn't he? He kept also a journal on top of all these other major works, and would comment with other people out in the social world. It said that he had dozens of writing desks in his house, that he would stop whenever he had an idea and start writing it down. This might be an exaggeration, maybe not. He did spend a lot of money on different luxuries like this as well. So we have all of these sorts of different interesting ways that he would approach the idea of his work. Since this is what he believed that he was put here on earth to do, he didn't waste his time in doing it. And really, Kierkegaard couldn't waste much time. He didn't live a very long life. If we end up, adding up the numbers, he died relatively young, when we might expect a lot more. It's odd that he was relatively broke the same time he died. So he kind of had this idea from his father that he wouldn't outlive his money, and he did a lot of spending and didn't leave a lot left, even though some of the works were bringing in money. During his death, at one point, it is said that he just kind of fell down in the street from a sort of illness. This happened on October 2nd of 1855. He was unconscious in the street, having a paralysis in his legs. He was then taken to Frederick's Hospital, where he'll spend the next 40 days with some sort of ailment of the spine, although the exact answer is a little bit unknown. His brother wanted to enter and see him, but because his brother was a part of the church, was a bishop, he rejected his brother, believing his brother to be a functionary and not a true Christian in this respect. He would allow his friend, a pastor Borson, to visit him daily, but when urged to have communion before he died, Kierkegaard rejected it. Not because he rejected communion, and as a good Lutheran, he would have looked forward to this as being essential for him. But he was asked if he wanted communion. He said yes, but not from a parson. He was willing to die without communion, believing that parsons are only royal functionaries and that they are not related to Christianity, and that he will receive true communion with God once he has passed. And so he's kind of going out on that message that he had about trying to make life hard. And the sacrament would bring him comfort and make his life easier. But he wanted to have real communion, not denying the real presence of the Eucharist, of course, but he wanted to have difficult communion with his God. He wanted to earnestly throw himself upon God's mercies and move forward within all of that. The 26 volumes of his work, the 29 different books of all of these things, were all there and are all important, but is about to encounter God, and he wanted to be there with God, having done what he was called and put here to do. In many ways, we have a very similar sort of parallel to Aquinas in his life, that Aquinas wanted the communion instead of the work, and Kierkegaard wanted the ecstasy that Aquinas had with communion, and thought he could only do that if he dived himself into his work. Right? So this is its own sort of fun discussion that can take place. In the work Fear and Trembling, we see this interesting sort of discussion. It opens up a story by Johannes de Silencio, right? That it is John the Silent who is the silent observer into this event. That we should approach these ideas with fear and trembling, being quiet is where the title is going to come from. It's not of a story of Abraham, but of a man who wants to understand what it would have been like for Abraham. For Abraham, with the being called by God to execute his son. Ultimately, the story of Abraham became one where the man wanted nothing more than to see how Abraham wrestled with God and what God called him to do in the story of what's commonly referred to as the binding of Isaac. So what's really interesting here is that Kierkegaard is shifting the story from the binding of Isaac, where it's really more about Isaac, and he's looking at what he identifies as the anguish of Abraham. And others will kind of quote him and move on in that direction. Traditionally speaking, this is the event that Isaac gets to show that he is a patriarch, that he's willing to die for God. It's not as much about Abraham as it is about his son. For Kierkegaard, he's looking at how does a man make an impossible decision. And if you're kind of reading between the two lines here, you're going to see that this is not really about Abraham and Isaac as much as it is about Kierkegaard and the love of his life for Jean Olsen. How is it that you can make an impossible decision where God is calling you to give up what you love most? How do you do that? And how do you remain true to your God and true to the woman or person that you love? This is really the subtext of all this, and we really get to see a fun sort of example of existentialism, where it's all about the choices and decisions we make, and that shapes our identity and how we are to move forward. But obedience becomes kind of essential and almost expected. And so in this sort of retelling, Johannes de Silencio is presenting 4 different versions of what he thinks might have been able to be the case when Abraham was called to give up the object of his love, his son. In the first version, God called Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Kierkegaard tells us that the ride was long and silent. Isaac was not able to understand his father's prayers. Then he saw his father going to kill him. And when Isaac saw Abraham's face, it was changed. His glance was wild, his form was horror. He seized Isaac by the throat and threw him to the ground and said, "Stupid boy, dost thou then suppose that I am thy father? I am an idolater. Dost thou suppose that this is God's bidding? No, it is my desire." Abraham's cry is then to God, "It is better for him to believe that I'm a monster rather than he should lose his faith in thee." He then pairs this sort of interesting story with different ways that mothers must reject their child, that they must be weaned off of the breast. It says the same must be done here, that the mother might blacken her breast so the child rejects the breast but not his mother. That this is the sort of call of what's going to be done. How is it that you do this? You don't want the child to reject the mother, so you blacken the breast so the child rejects the breast. Abraham doesn't want Isaac to reject God, so he makes himself the demon. He changes his face and not that of his God. He says, "No, I'm the idolater." Does Abraham tell Isaac, "I did it, now hate God too"? No, not in this version. Does Soren say to Regine, "God told me I have to leave you. Sorry"? No, because then she will regret God, not just the man she was engaged to. The second version of the story continues that Abraham prepared to do what God had called him to do, but simply could not. Therefore, he could not forget that God required this of him. And Isaac throve as ever before, but Abraham's eyes were darkened, and he knew no more joy. If by chance Abraham just wants to say, "No, God, I can't do it. What you're requesting is too much. This is too difficult," then Abraham won't know God. Isaac can be as before, but he won't have any real joy in his life. Just as Soren couldn't have any joy in his life if he was to be married, even though Regine might not know any difference. Probably she would figure it out. But this is the sort of fear and thought that's going to be there. Again, when a child must be weaned, it has to grow big and be weaned. The mother virginally hides her breast, so the child has no more mother. Happy is the child who did not another way lose his mother. Right? Just hiding it away by rejecting it. It never exists. Doesn't always solve the problem either. The third version proceeds that Abraham thought the sacrifice that he already did, recalling back Hagar and Ishmael, putting them out, and was unable to do it, but cried out to God to forgive his sin, not in his inability to sacrifice his son, but that he would even consider it After all, it is his duty of a father to protect his child. Right here, I'm already engaged. I already owe Regine something, legally, contractually, religiously, emotionally, socially, all of these things. I have certain obligations. How dare I reject my obligations? Right? Looking back at already what I have given, right? There becomes a sort of self-justification and not true humility within this respect. And therefore, it's not really being dutiful. And you're not really following through with what God requires, according to Kierkegaard or Johannes de Silencio here. Here, the mother is also so sorrowful that when a child must be weaned, that they mourn the loss of that aspect of their relationship together, that both are putting this away and mourning this loss. And maybe he can mention at least of what he's being called to or expected to do at this moment. In the fourth and final version of the story, Abraham did what God called him to do, and the relationship between the father and the son was therefore ruined. He held out the knife and said, God told me to do this, and ended up having this fight. Isaac had lost his faith, and Isaac never talked to anyone about what he had seen, but Abraham did not suspect that anyone had seen it. Right? There becomes this sort of, I'm having to do it, and this relationship is broken now. Maybe even the relationship between you and God, but at least I did it, and I'm, not happy about it, and you're not happy about it either. And here, when the child is weaned, he says that the child is weaned from the breast by eating other food, right? That you need to give somebody something else. You need to give somebody, the child, the food and the readiness. You need to provide something new. And this is really what he's going to say is what Abraham had to do. Abraham had to explain to Isaac, not only are you losing out, but you're going to be gaining something as a result. There's going to be some benefit to this loss. It's not just that I hate you and despise you, or that God does, but that this is for life, right? That this might be a resurrection or a miracle or something. Therefore, same with the child who now has food rejected. There should be something else, right? New solid foods that take the place, that a new life opens up within all of this. And Kierkegaard is trying to say that this is really what he needs to make sure to keep in mind as well. That he's not simply rejecting Regina, but that he's providing her something, a happy life with somebody who can spend all of his time with them. Now again, he's still madly in love with her. He still gave her all of his royalties, etc., all go down her family line. And everyone knows the two of them and not so much her future husband. But this is the thought, that this needs to be provided in this love story. This work ends with, Abraham, who is capable of understanding him? What does he demonstrate for us? What does he show us? The idea is that in every decision that is before us, we must choose. And the choice, we must face the consequences. And there will be consequences. That is what's absolutely important for existentialism as Kierkegaard sees it. You're not making a choice to avoid consequences. This isn't just to make your life easier. In fact, oftentimes the consequences will be hard. But this is what we are called to do. This is the challenge. Even in how we respond, we can alter the relationships we have with other people. This is a difficult task, trying to conform our wills to what God sees in ourselves, but this is what's called for by the theistic existentialist. Even when the task before us is an impossible one for us to do, we are still called to do the impossible. Kierkegaard will end up saying he did it by giving up the love of his life, that Abraham will offer his son. All of us have challenges, big ones, that we need to do impossible things for, but we all need to do that. Most of us, by the way, are not going to be called to make such extreme decisions, but this is why it requires a leap of faith to accept all of this for Kierkegaard, and that this is the push, that we must reject the temptations or passions which seek to make our life easy, as opposed to making the deliberate decisions to conform our wills a difficult decision. Right? And so this becomes a very important thing for existentialism here, right? Every decision has to be weighed out. How much time do you spend in your day-to-day life thinking about the ramifications of each of the possible outcomes of your decision, of the different ways that you can approach a difficult task? Do you have one way? Do you have four ways? Do you just do it? Right? The weight of all of these things and controlling your life is what we really are called to do, according to Kierkegaard. And this is kind of the broader aspect of what he sees the job of his philosophy to do, his writings, and what we are going to be reading and discussing as time goes by. Since ethics is really about all these decisions that we have to make, some of them are very obvious and some of them are impossible, we're going to see, as we're discussing different ethical theories over the next couple of lessons, a lot of weight that says this is the right one or that's the wrong one, and the reasons and ground for this. We need to be able to have some criteria for judging the adequacy of these theories. And so the best way to do that, before we go much further, is to think about some ground rules that we might have to judge the adequacy of these theories. Traditionally speaking, how we're going to judge the adequacy of theories is going to be based on three different criteria. The first is universality. Universality has at its very basis the idea that it should account for all of the facts, or at least more of the facts than any of the other rival theories might hold. This rule approaches ideas based on how much knowledge that theory can hold, and it makes sure that the gaps that exist in its logic are ones that we can reconcile because maybe it's just unknown. Otherwise, we throw out this theory because it doesn't really apply, or it doesn't fit within our worldview. This also ties in very close with notions of consistency. If a theory is lacking its universality, sometimes it's seeming to be a little inconsistent. It might apply to some people and not other people. And we want to know that what is there and what is present is consistent. After all, consistency is the key for a good moral life. Very rarely would somebody say, well, it's okay for you to do this over here, but not over there. Now, there are also different ways we can look at consistency. Some things are internally consistent, right? The theory might have various inconsistencies within itself. It might tell you to do one thing and also to tell you that that's impossible. It might set up a criteria where you're not able to do what it tells you have to do. Some will interpret, for instance, the story of God's commands to Adam and Eve in the garden, that they be fruitful and multiply, and also not partaking of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and of course believing that God is good, and see that this works just fine. There are other groups, primarily growing out of 19th century America, who ended up saying that they wouldn't have been able to be fruitful and multiply. They wouldn't have been able to go out and subdue the world if they had not first partaken of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Here, what we have is an inconsistency with this interpretation, that God, who's supposedly good and loving, gives them a commandment and then tells them the only way to do the other commandment he's going to give them is by violating that first one. Of course, you can come up with a lot of different arguments on how you're going to look and interpret this story, but largely these facts don't easily line up. You're going to have to find ways of making that, 3 steps internally consistent. The other criteria that we're going to deal with is external consistency. Sometimes ideas are not consistent with the world around us. Most of you don't hold the Platonic understanding of the universe, at least not consciously or in its totality. Most of you, I'd argue probably all of you, believe that the world is round, that the world is not flat. And while somebody might give you facts and data, usually flat Earth society people are kind of doing this as a sort of logical test case and paradox thinking and a puzzle to be solved. Usually they're not all that serious with their contentions, but right, you're not going to be swayed by an argument that the world is flat because it's not consistent with how you see everything else. That it, of course, involves you entirely changing your mentality on how you live and operate in the world. The third criteria, next to universality and consistency, is the notion of simplicity. Generally speaking, we prefer theories that are simpler. The real champion of simplicity is Occam. William of Occam, 1285 to 1347, was a British theologian and philosopher. He stated that of all other theories being equal, the simpler one is usually the correct one. This is known as the law of parsimony and is really the way that a lot of us just move and operate in the world. Now, sometimes we have to admit the complex answer is the correct one, but we'd prefer that we can have an ethical theory that is actually able to be applied. If it has all of the answers and is consistent both internally and externally, but we're not able to actually grasp or do it, even though it might be right, it might not be as right as one that's maybe a little less consistent or a little less universal, but is something we can do and apply. We might concede that, yes, this other one is indeed the perfect answer, but we're not perfect people. And so maybe the better is better than perfect. Right? There's a phrase, don't let good, perfect be the enemy of good enough. And sometimes we do run into this issue when talking about morality. At its very heart, again, when we're talking about these ethical theories, you need to know what you're choosing to do. What theories work, keeping in these criterias of universality, consistency, and simplicity. Doesn't necessarily make everything simple and easy going forward, but at least it gives us a place where we're able to move from and start.